Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with the humble meals, metal spoons, and boiled everything of third-class passengers aboard the RMS Titanic. Because the majority of passengers were fortunate to receive boiled potatoes that remained intact, whereas most people envision caviar and crystal chandeliers. The third-class dining experience was more about calories than elegance, a far cry from the first-class dining rooms with their elaborate meals and wine lists that resembled Shakespearean dramas. However, that doesn't mean it wasn't somewhat noteworthy in its own unique way. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. You anticipated the worst. You weren't considering luxury when you purchased your third-class ticket on the RMS Titanic. There should be a bed, a floor, and an edible object that doesn't move, you thought. Steerage passengers packed into dim, airless cabins with more mice than spoons. You'd heard the horror stories. Thus you hesitate as soon as you enter the F-Deck's third-class dining saloon. Because this isn't all that horrible. No livestock in sight, no bales of hay. It is also remarkably free of the odor of cooked dread. Instead, you find long wooden tables, real chairs, not crates, and actual walls that are painted white, not peeling white, on purpose white. Instead of candles crammed between turnips and tiled floors beneath, there are electric lights above. You blinked. Are you in the proper location? Yes, you are. You've just been firmly but gently promoted from steerage livestock to a respectable person who uses cutlery in third class on the Titanic. Yes, it's under half a continent of riches and silverware toward the back of the ship. It's not like you're hanging around with dukes. However, this is better than what most of the passengers in your section had back home. More potatoes per square foot, safer, cleaner, and warmer than the majority of Irish farmhouses. You aren't given a menu, and you won't have to decide between salmon with dill and duck confit. But real stewards who don't yell at you serve the food hot at predetermined times. You sit down to eat at a genuine table with other immigrants who, like you, have just brought a suitcase, a goal, and perhaps a family member who is constantly losing their shoes. The bread may be difficult enough to defend yourself with, and there is no drink or music. Overall, though, it's a strange and yet lovely experience. Honor. You're not treated like luggage with teeth for the first time in a long time. You are a traveler. Here, you're welcome. As soon as you enter the third-class dining saloon, you think, oh, this is too clean. There's a problem. Where are the buckets, the leeks, and the man with the turnip hat? You're actually here, though. You tread cautiously on the tiled floor, almost expecting to find disappointment or dirt beneath your feet. It doesn't. It's sturdy, well-designed, and, dare I say it, respectable. Sturdy wooden tables and benches line the length of the space, which runs along the middle of the F-Deck. It has the vibe of a school cafeteria. If everyone brought their own stories and steamer trunks, the school would have 700 pupils and no blackboard. The tables are fastened to the floor with bolts, most likely, to prevent them from slipping into your lap in the event that the ship tilts. Soothing. Electric lights burn steadily overhead, nor gas-powered, nor flashing. Electrical. Newspapers have told you about this kind of event. Locations with wires and switches that function without the use of magic, candles, or oil. You are now dining beneath them while acting as though nothing is wrong. There are also the walls. White-painted, smooth, and strangely mildew-free. There was not a single wet spot to be seen. You're beginning to question whether you wandered into second class by accident. However, you are immediately reassured by the 14 kids shouting in 7 different languages and the absence of napkins. With a hint of soap in the background, the air smells like something that has been boiled, most likely potatoes. You are surprised by that last part. Soap? Understeerage? It's obvious that someone on the white Star Line design team went overboard. You are seated next to strangers on a long bench who you will probably never understand. A man from Sweden gives you a nod. The bread is blessed by a Sicilian woman. The boundaries of gravity are already being tested by a toddler holding a spoon the size of their arm. This is order, but it's not luxury. The food was served promptly in a well-lit, spacious room with a subtle hint of cleanliness. Instead than being crammed into corners like luggage, you eat shoulder to shoulder. And it feels like you've already arrived in this dining room if you've traveled across nations only to have a chance at tomorrow. Think again if you believed that the Titanic's third-class dining area served everyone at once. Eating in steerage is more about strategy than mealtime, as you soon discover. The only way to make it work is to use the dining equivalent of traffic control, with over 700 passengers fighting for chair and stew space. Scheduled shifts. You don't get a printed timetable or a polite chime to guide you. It's more organic, a kind of instinct like birds migrating. You see people standing, you hear plates clinking. It's our turn, someone murmurs. Your cue is that. Your shift starts. You squeeze in, you take a seat. You don't inquire about your remaining time. Less than you'd like is the response. Everything is hot and undamaged for the early eaters. The bread is still a little soft. Inexplicably, the stew has not yet solidified. These individuals move like skilled pros with concentration. They have their elbows tucked in. Their spoons make all the difference. It's amazing. Then there is the intermediate wave, which is your group. It's you who get the lukewarm stew, the slightly wobbly chairs, and the table that smells like carrots and regret. You convince yourself that it develops character. Last but not least are the stew survivors, the stragglers, and the last shift. These are the people that eat slowly while surrounded by crumbs and mayhem, while sipping tea that could actually be dishwater. They arrive famished and depart with a philosophical outlook. However, there is an understanding regardless of when you sit. Now eat. Later we can talk. The food has arrived, there is not much time, and your seat is most likely already being eyed by someone. If there are any conversations, they are quick and practical. Give the bread to them. This fork is warm. Is this cabbage? It was. No one complains. Not seriously, because this is still a luxury in comparison to what most third-class passengers are used to, even with the hurried pace, sharing utensils, and the occasional mystery ingredient. Like passing the torch in a relay race run solely on politeness and potatoes, you stand up when your turn is over, clean your plate, and move on to the next round. You get back to your cabin a little faster, a little fuller, and with a fresh understanding of the variety of methods to boil a meal. On the Titanic, morning arrives early, particularly in third class, when light seems to stream from everywhere, and someone's infant is always crying. You get up, get dressed, if you call rubbing yesterday's clothes flat dressing, and head for the dining saloon, following the aroma of hot carbs. They provide breakfast. There are no bells, butlers, or dramatic music, just the sound of plates being served, and a steward giving you a vague gesture that suggests the food is edible, most likely. You sit down and look around you. The atmosphere is concentrated. It's the ideal moment to eat something that will remain in your stomach like a faithful companion for the remainder of the day, but it's also too early for discussion and too late to return to bed. On the table, a generous portion of porridge which has the consistency of warm wallpaper paste, but considerably more nutritional value. You don't ask what grain it is. No one does. The important thing is that it's heated. Slices of bread that were undoubtedly cooked this week are placed next to it. They are plain, thick, and a little heroic in their will to stay together. Next to it is a pat of margarine that looks like butter, but isn't. Then there is tea, which is timeless, dependable, and powerful enough to bend a spoon. It comes in a tin mug, steaming with a boiling resolve flavor profile, with a hint of tan. If your objective is emotional fortitude and hydration, it goes very well with the bread. Marmalade, a zesty surprise that tastes like sugar, and sunshine colliding and getting trapped in a jar, is served to certain fortunate tables. If a jar does get up on your table, it is rationed like medicine and protected like treasure. Furthermore, the dinner is surprisingly filling in, spite of the lack of diversity. No eggs, bacon, or even a dejected little sausage are present. However, you feel stable and nourished, as if your digestive tract was just given a warm blanket and instructed to settle in. This is the type of breakfast that will keep you standing on a wobbling ship with too many steps and no elevator, but it won't impress your taste buds. Your body gently indicates that it's time for another round of starch-based diplomacy by noon, when your breakfast has completely become ingrained in your soul. This is the big one. Supper, or lunch as it was known in the past, because Edwardians enjoyed making things confusing for future generations. You enter the eating saloon as a member of the second or possibly third shift. Who knows? Time aboard ship is measured in meal times, not minutes. The room already smells like steam, gravy, and optimism. A bowl of soup is placed in front of you by the steward. It's remarkably beige, spicy, and somewhat vegetable-like. Even the cook is unsure of its exact contents, but it's reassuring in the same way as a warm bath is reassuring if turnips are added. The main course is a slab of roast beef, which is aptly referred to as both beef and roast because it isn't foul and was cooked with heat. It is chewy, solid, and resolutely filling. It is accompanied with a mound of boiling potatoes that are so high up that you almost think a goat may start climbing them. Thick, salty sauce may be liberally poured, not to flavor the meat, but to preserve your molars. Like edible mortar, it holds everything together. To add color and give the appearance of variation, a few boiled peas or carrots roll into your dish. Of course, bread is the Titanic counterpart of air. Until someone talks to you, you can use it to clean up your plate, gesture for more stew, or simply chew in time. Numerous languages are being spoken simultaneously in the room, including Swedish, Irish, Italian, and Serbian. When someone says something you don't understand, you raise your tea in a toast to global confusion and nod courteously. No one is complaining, but no one is acting like this is exquisite food. You're sitting down, eating, and staying warm. That's 3 victories in one. After scraping off the last of your potatoes, you take a moment to relax and consider how something so basic can still be so fulfilling. The steward then cleans the table, clears your dish, and makes an ambiguous motion toward the door, because another hungry shift is already lining up somewhere behind you. You've already seen half the ship, lost a game of cards to a disturbingly self-assured child, and heard a small quarrel about whose suitcase smelled the strongest of onions by the time supper arrives. You've worked up an appetite, of course. Depending on how perplexed you are by Edwardian meal names, supper is not as ambitious as dinner or lunch. Impressing is not its purpose. Its purpose is to help you go asleep without creating any intestinal distress. As you settle in, the stewards once more provide a simple spread that reads, "Let's not make a fuss, shall we?" Cold meats were thinly sliced and put on the platter with the zeal of a man who had just finished slicing 700 plates of cold meat today. What sort of meat? No one inquires. It's perfectly adequate, slightly seasoned, and slightly pink. You chew carefully, as though thinking about where it came from will enhance its flavor. It doesn't. Cheese, which is often white, crumbly, and has the characteristics of a wet block, is placed next to the meat. Nevertheless, it goes nicely with the dependable bread, which has grown to be your best friend on this journey. You two have come to understand each other. It is not questioned. It doesn't let you down. Of course, there's more tea always. Titanic's third class may not offer wine, ale, or dignity in portion sizes, but it will keep your cup full of strong, dark brew until the end of time. You carefully drink it, in part to savor it, and in part to hold it in. Two young men are silently discussing whether this is the nicest lunch they have ever had, while a child is singing a few tables away and another is snoring in the middle of their meal. It most likely is, judging by the seriousness of their argument. There is hardly any fruit and no dessert, but the simplicity of it all exudes a certain calm contentment. The room feels a little less frantic, the day is coming to an end, and the lights are dimmed, as if everyone has decided to keep their elbows to themselves for this one dinner. If you bothered to pretend you had a napkin, you fold it after you eat the last bite, and then sit back, feeling full. If not in taste, then at least in emotion. Supper isn't particularly thrilling, but it's sufficient, shared, and warm. During the journey, while enjoying your third cup of tea and munching on a piece of bread that might be used for roofing, you begin to question, where is the beer? It's a celebration after all. You've eaten potatoes 3 times today, you're embarking on a new life, and you're crossing the Atlantic. This is one of the things that merits a pint. However, it is officially forbidden to serve alcohol in third class. Although it's not strictly prohibited, the policy highly discourages it, which in reality means you should either bring your own or be ready to maintain extreme sobriety. Nevertheless, you begin to notice things. The man at the adjacent table is guarding a strangely shaped flask as though it were a holy relic. Young Irishmen, curiously happy, kept coming back after deck walks. One Italian guy says his tea is spicy, which might be a language error or a sign of overconfidence. Technically, beer can be bought at the third-class bar, according to rumors circulating the saloon. There was a bar indeed. It was tiny, hidden away, and had regulations so ambiguous you'd believe they were created by monks from antiquity. If you were courageous, fortunate, and proficient in Edwardian bureaucratic babble, you could attempt placing an order. Third class, however, was a teetotaler's paradise for the majority of travellers. Water or tea was always offered with meals. You may assume it originated from a French vineyard or mix your tea for variation. The majority of people, however, didn't miss it. They were either minding their kids, saving money, or still getting over whatever rough cider they had consumed prior to boarding. You were on a floating lifeboat to opportunity, not a drunken cruise. Furthermore, the last thing you need is someone attempting to play poker on a bread bench while surrounded by 60 distinct accents, clattering plates, and the continuous rumble of engines below deck. You remind yourself that sobriety has its advantages, take another sip of strong, unsweetened tea, and nod knowingly to the man holding the enigmatic flask. For example, knowing your bunk location and avoiding confusing a lifeboat for an outhouse at 2 in the morning. You eventually wonder how many different methods there are to make stew instead of what's for supper. Because stew is more than just a meal, it's a way of life in third class on the Titanic. As you soon discover, stew may be found in any meal, at any time, with any ingredients, and under any name. Meat and vegetable mixture, Irish stew, or simply hot. Stew is the main attraction, whether it's served for lunch, dinner, or some enigmatic in-between nibble that someone came up with during a difficult time at sea. Don't get too thrilled just yet. This isn't a delicate bay leaf and thyme-infused slow-cooked masterpiece. No, it's a practical stew. It's a thick, boiling mixture of root vegetables, meat-like compounds, and willpower. It primarily tastes of salt, fortitude, and turnip ghost. It's not bad, though. It is filling, warm, and has a tendency of sticking to your ribs, so even tomorrow you will still feel it. And you feel strangely appreciative of that. The stew is treated with reverence by everyone in your vicinity. Full-grown men can be seen gazing into their bowls as if they were pondering in silence whether the chunk floating in the broth is actually beef, mutton, or just a particularly muscular parsnip. The temperature is best characterized as lava adjacent, So you learn to eat it quickly, not because it's so good you can't wait. It will either burn your tongue or turn into something more like cement if you don't catch it in time. It's amazing how much food the culinary crew produces, enough to feed hundreds of people every day, from what must be the most valiant cauldron in the world. Imagine a perspiring cook using an oar to stir the soup while whispering encouragement to the carrots. There aren't any seconds, of course. It's not a smorgasbord here. You take what you're given, smile courteously, and act as though you didn't just bitten into something that may have been shoe leather or cabbage. You might have thought that you would be eating with your hands, or perhaps a splintered stick that someone had fashioned into a spoon before your first supper on board the Titanic. You're in third class after all. When a steward delivers you real cutlery, it's a welcome surprise because you're not expecting much. Not engraved with a family crest or gold-plated, but it's metal, clean, useful, and most importantly, it matches. You think about framing it for a moment. You get a spoon, a fork, and, on exceptional occasions, a knife that was obviously sharpened on a rock a century ago. It cuts, though, for the most part. Eventually. Your dishes are made of sturdy white enamel and have a few minor chips as if they have seen things but don't want to discuss them. As they are laid out, they clink softly, signaling to everyone that dinner is now a serious affair. And the mug comes next, a thick, unapologetic, handleless cup made of ceramic or tin. It contains water, tea, or whatever next shady liquid comes up. Informally, it is also a percussive instrument, a hand warmer, and a light intimidation weapon when needed. You rapidly come to like it. Napkins? Avoid becoming avaricious. You have a neighbor's elbow, a sleeve, and the hazy hope that this time the gravy would stay on the plate. In order to avoid a Titanic-style supper slip during rough seas, the tables are bolted to the floor. The communal broad benches are just large enough to sit on without ever feeling completely relaxed. The core strength of a circus performer teaches you how to brace, lean, and balance. It turns out that eating is a full-body activity. The way these tools are employed has an almost noble quality despite their simplicity. Everyone sharing space, chasing stew around a plate, you, your fellow travelers, and a spoon that formerly served 12 different countries. Additionally, you don't throw away your cutlery after a meal. Since this is the Titanic and there are, in a sense, standards even in third class, you arrange things nicely. Still chewing a little, you get up from the table and take one final look at your spoon before it's cleared away. You wonder who's actually preparing all this food. At some point, most likely, while you're chewing on your fourth boiled potato of the journey. Because hundreds of passengers are eating 3 meals a day in addition to tea, bread, and whatever stew it was feigning to be, and it's not just you. It's a logistical marvel, not just cooking. The third-class galley, hidden away like a secret you're not supposed to know about, holds the key to the solution. Unless you slip down there, which, let's face it, you're probably too full and too courteous to try, you won't ever see it. The endurance of caffeinated badgers and the military accuracy of an army of cooks and assistants work down in the galley. They are heroes in any century because they can peel, chop, and stir for 700 people without crying, even though they are not famous chefs or sign autographs. Their equipment consists of large cauldrons that could easily accommodate a badger family if needed. In addition to boiling meat and stewing vegetables, these iron beasts may also be employed to conceal the odd shoe. Everything is enormous, including bread trays that may be used as little sleds if you're feeling rebellious, ladles that resemble oars, and pots the size of bathtubs. There is no space for flair or individual interpretation because menus are made with brutal efficiency. No one is suggesting that this dish be spiced up with lemon zest. No, if you have carrots, you add them. If you run out of animal, you subtract flesh, and yet the food still shows up, often hot, sometimes edible, and amazingly satisfying. The entire organization has an amazing quality. the unseen toil of men and women shouting over blazing stoves, sweating through aprons, and a third-class traveller like you would ask, "Is this beef?" on a piece of bread that was before the iceberg while spreading margarine. You silently honour them by lifting your spoon, but they won't hear you do it. This journey would be far more wretched and unsavoury without them, but they're too busy making 700 more servings of tea and maybe conversing with the stew as though it were a real thing. After surviving a few meals in third class on the Titanic, you start to see a pattern, a sort of dining choreography that happens just as planned. Sit, nod, eat as if the ship was sinking, and then depart. The problem is because you're using a timer, not an official one, mind you. No steward is flipping a sand glass or blowing a whistle. However, the pressure is significant when 700 people must eat in a room designed for half that number. It is considered improper to linger over your cabbage. There is a race between your hunger and the following shift as soon as your food is placed on the table. With their heads down, elbows tucked, and spoons going at survival speed, everyone around you adopts a similar rhythm. It's more practical and less romantic, like synchronized eating. There is conversation, but only in short spurts. A harsh, "That's my cup," a whispered, "Pass the bread," or the sporadic, philosophical argument about whether it was steak or just a carrot with a lot of seasoning. You try to make eye contact with the steward once, just to say thanks, but they vanish like ghosts, whisking away plates before you even set down your spoon. These individuals have the agility of ninjas and the concentration of librarians on caffeine. There's no time for small conversation about the weather, dreams, or the advantages and disadvantages of living off of cabbage. When it does occur, even laughter feels rushed, as though happiness must fit in between gulps of lukewarm tea and bits of stew. You've never shown such reverence for digestion. Each swallow is a precise act. Chewing anything more than strictly necessary is a waste of time. You've witnessed local veterans masterfully butter a second roll after disassembling a platter in 2 minutes. Someone behind you coughs nicely just as you're thinking, "Maybe I'll sit a little longer, just a sip of tea." Or not in such a courteous manner. "Time's up, stew soldier," a clear signal. In a farewell ceremony between strangers united by boiled roots, you get up, nod to the table, and move away to make room for the next group. Meals in third class are more than just a source of nutrition. It's possible that you went on the Titanic with the expectation of dining with people who were similar to you in terms of language, attire, and perhaps even your love of root vegetables. However, no, the third-class dining area is more of a continental buffet of humans than a peaceful mess hall. You are seated next to strangers from all walks of life: Ireland, Sweden, Syria, Italy, Poland, and a few other locations you faintly remember from a church map. No seating chart is available. You are not grouped by profession or nationality. It's simply whoever arrived with a spoon and an optimistic outlook at the same time as you did, a Serbian grandmother who speaks almost entirely through raised eyebrows and critical looks at the bread, an Irish widow with 5 children and the air of a general, and a Swedish carpenter who eats with the precision of a surgeon are all at your table. Within 5 minutes, you all join an unwritten agreement, even though none of you know one another. Never critique someone else's margarine method, never take more than your fair portion, and chuckle silently. Around you, the languages blend into a symphony of half-smiles, mumbles, and mutters. Before the soup is served, you may hear 5 different prayers. Individuals occasionally translate for one another. Sometimes you're too courteous to ask, so you just shrug and pass the salt, which may not be salt at all. Every now and again, someone tries to start a conversation that goes beyond the typical stew remark. Usually it's about who you left behind, where you're going, or if you believe this bread might stop a bullet. You react cautiously because even in the absence of words, everyone in this room is juggling equal amounts of fear and exhilaration. Sharing a meal with strangers on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, with none of you fully knowing what awaits you on the other side, creates a peculiar type of connection. However, the stew strangely helps. It is universal. It crosses boundaries. The common effort of trying to figure out what's floating in there is what unites people. You don't know everyone's name as you leave the meal. However, you recall how the Norwegian child shared his marmalade, how the Italian girl smiled, and how the Serbian grandmother secretly criticized your spoon hold. By now, you're used to third-class meals, tea, stews, and the exciting uncertainty surrounding the origins of meat. But after a while, curiosity takes over. You begin to wonder about the activities of the top decks. What exactly are they eating? Even worse, what are you not? First of all, there isn't even a stale pudding masquerading as a Christmas dessert in third class. Bread, stew, and the odd mystery veggie are all provided. But if you're craving something sweet, you'd best hope someone spilled a raisin on the floor. In the meantime, first-class travelers are up there savoring 10-course meals with unpronounceable titles and made-up ingredients. Chartreuse jelly with peach compote. You would be content with a snooze and a baked apple. Additionally, there is no menu option. Your preferred food cannot be requested. You eat what is provided to you without asking questions or making any changes. You can send it a nasty letter and move on if stew isn't your thing. No introductions from waitstaff either. Stewards likely mumble things like, "Your roast, madam, aged precisely 21 days in first class." A man puts down your dish in third class and then vanishes like a ghost in an apron. Additionally, disregard candlelight tablecloths and centerpieces. Using whatever is available, possibly a sleeve, you wipe down your table. If your spoon isn't still wet from someone else's tea, you're lucky. Drinking alcohol? No, still. We've already discussed this, but hearing about the sophisticated wine pairings upstairs while you're still trying to get flavor out of your third cup of tea hurts a little more. Fruit is a rare sight too. They're using golden forks to slice oranges and nibbling grapes in first class. If you took a banana out of your pocket down here, it would start a stampede. Nevertheless, the third-class dining room never feels resentful, just practical. In spite of the lack of decorations, the lack of style, and the overall dearth of dessert, you get nourished even if you don't have the luxuries. You receive company and comfort. And when someone passes the bread without being asked, you have that one wonderful moment. You've found a sort of rhythm by now. Get up, eat, steer clear of crowds of kids, and repeat. Even though the meals are straightforward, they are delivered on schedule and, for the most part, keep your stomach calm. Then Sunday, April 14th, arrives. You may not be aware of it yet, but this will be the final dinner ever served in the third-class saloon of the Titanic. On paper, that night's dinner is nothing special. More boiled potatoes, stew, and, if the kitchen crew felt particularly generous, roast pig. Perhaps it's your imagination trying to add pathos to a dinner roll, but you notice that the bread is a bit fresher. As usual, they eat efficiently, noisily, and with hunger. The air is filled with laughter. Someone just spilled tea on a youngster who is now ecstatic to be noticed. A boy is playing a harmonica, and a couple is celebrating their engagement. Nobody has any suspicions. Why would they? The man beside you and you have a brief conversation regarding your arrival in New York. You joke that you might arrive heavier than when you boarded if the ship continues to feed you in this manner. Although that's not a very good joke, it makes you laugh. The room is filled with a sense of hope, as if everyone thinks the next wave will be the last. You witness young guys exchanging dreams, parents soothing infants, and elderly people silently gazing into their cups as if they were deciphering omens from the tea leaves. As usual, you complete your dinner, the last piece of meat, the final cup of tea, and get up. You have no idea that this will be the last time you do this. The odd thing is that seldom do final moments make themselves known. You wonder about breakfast as you head back to your bunk. You question whether marmalade will be served again. You're hoping for an early shift. It seems like you're finally learning how to butter bread without it breaking in two like a shoddy raft. The ship steams off into the night of the North Atlantic. The third-class dining room is clean, empty, and silent inside. Nobody is aware that it's finished, not quite yet. What's left over after everything? The tea, the stew, the bread that could be used to repair a roof. You worked in shifts, had no menus, little ceremony, and subsisted on food that wouldn't win awards, but it gave you food. Something quieter than your stomach, something more difficult to identify. Naturally, as word of the sinking spread, everyone's eyes were drawn to the opulent dining rooms, the big staircase, and the orchestra playing as the ship descended. Naturally dramatic. However, beneath all of that on Deck F, there were also stories in a simple room with white walls, tile flooring, and benches fastened to the floor. No champagne was being sipped by third-class passengers. They were holding on to bread rolls, putting coats on sleeping kids, and pondering how someone could drown in a structure as large and contemporary as the Titanic. Later on, some would remember the dining room as the final peaceful place they sat, the final place they felt hopeful, and the final place when things were still normal. Much of it was lost, of course. The sea swallowed tables, benches, and bathtub-sized pots. Nobody ever took pictures of your spoon, the soup recipes were never published, and the menus were never printed. If you listen, you may still hear what the humble were eating, even though history rarely asks this question. The clatter of languages, the bubbling of stew, and the silent thanks before meals are all examples of this, in addition to the clang of silverware. You hear children licking tin cups and giggling at nothing, mums slicing bread into equal halves, and fathers acting as though they adore cabbage. That was never a fancy dining room. It made no effort to be. It was warm, useful, and perhaps a bit too excited about potatoes. However, it was also human, shared, and enduring. It was a unique setting where community flourished without linen, wine lists, or orchestras, in a ship that was split by class. That place and those dinners were important, even though it is now at the bottom of the Atlantic, somewhere beneath a century's worth of water and myth. One of the biggest mysteries in Roman military history started with a catastrophe in 53 BCE. Leading 7 legions eastward into Parthian territory was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and a member of the first triumvirate, along with Julius Caesar and Pompey. His objective was straightforward: to establish Roman supremacy in the east and achieve military glory. Rather, he marched into disaster. The Parthian Empire, who were experts at horse archery and desert warfare, confronted Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae, which took place close to the border of present-day Turkey. Crassus had overestimated his adversary, even though he was in charge of about 40,000 Roman soldiers. Despite only bringing roughly 10,000 horsemen, General Serena's Parthians proved lethal because to their mobility and unrelenting volleys of arrows, the vast plains rendered Roman formations useless since they were designed for close quarters and set-piece combat. The Parthians surrounded and destroyed the Roman army over the course of 2 days. Early in the conflict, Crassus's son Publius perished after being encircled and overpowered. After being enticed into a peace talks, Crassus was put to death, with his head reportedly being used as a prop in a Parthian play. About 20,000 Romans had died by the end, but at least 10,000 more were missing, not dead, not found, just gone. And this is where the mystery starts following Carrhae. According to modern Roman sources, hundreds of Roman troops were seized and transported far into Parthian territory, where they were probably employed as laborers or soldiers along the eastern edge of the empire. However, what became to them afterwards? No one could say for ages. Chinese records would then come to light many years later, describing odd foreign armies with peculiar fighting formations. Troops that fought in a manner that was unfamiliar to all Asian armies at the time. Is it possible that these vanished Romans travelled even further east, into China or Central Asia? Although the concept seems like historical fiction, the mystery has only grown as a result of the silence surrounding these missing men. They weren't your typical inmates. They were disciplined, valuable, and trained legionaries. Furthermore, these males were frequently reused rather than discarded in the ancient world. The myth of the missing Roman legion was born. Historians began to question whether Roman soldiers had ever reached the Far East, as odd hints started to surface from Central Asian towns and ancient Chinese literature. Or was the entire tale based on the remains of a battleground? The Parthians were left with thousands of Roman prisoners, possibly as many as 10,000 men, after the disastrous defeat at Carrhae. These were neither raw recruits nor supplementary forces. The core of the Roman military apparatus, they were seasoned legionaries. The Parthians recognized opportunity as Rome lamented its dead and boiled with wrath. Parthian authorities, especially General Serena, took a more calculated strategy than putting all the survivors to death or enslaving them. They scattered the prisoners around their empire, settling many of them far from the Roman borders in the northern frontiers. According to historical accounts, some of these troops were moved to Margiana, which is now Merv, in Turkmenistan. An important eastern frontier for the Parthian Empire, this oasis city was situated close to the edge of the Central Asian steppes. It is thought that the Romans were incorporated into the indigenous military establishment there. They were not idiots, the Parthians. They had personally witnessed the efficiency of Roman engineering, discipline, and formations. It made logical to use these individuals as construction workers, border guards, or even as special troops in their own armies. With nomadic incursions posing a continual threat, Margiana would have been a perfect place to garrison foreign troops, close enough to protect the outskirts of the empire, but far enough from their country to quell mutiny. However, the historical record becomes quiet at this point. Plutarch and other Roman authors discuss the defeat, the humiliation, and the number of deaths, but they say relatively nothing about what happened to the prisoners. Sparse and fractured, Parthian records provide nothing in exchange. The warriors appear to disappear into the sands of the desert. Speculation arises from this silence. According to some theories, the Romans lost their identity over many generations as a result of their intermarriage with natives. Others think that a core group stayed together, maintained their military organization, and continued to operate as an auxiliary or mercenary force that was out of Rome's grasp. However, centuries later, intriguing accounts start to surface in Chinese historical documents. A mystery group of soldiers who employed a fish-scale configuration are described in these sources, dissimilar to what is observed in conventional Asian combat. Are those identical Roman captives mentioned in these accounts? If so, it's possible that the Roman legionnaires who marched to Carrhae in search of gold and conquest really contributed to the history of a far-off place that the empire they once served forgot about. Although the route east was lengthy, it might not be insurmountable. The Han Dynasty's official chronicles contain an intriguing entry from almost 150 years after the Battle of Kar. It tells of a conflict between Han armies and Jiji Chanyu of the Xiongnu, a Central Asian king in 36 BCE in the far western regions of China. The fight was fought along the Talas River in present-day Kazakhstan, close to the city of Jiji's stronghold. In the Book of Han, the Han historian Bangu claims that Chinese generals saw a peculiar contingent of foreign warriors in Jiji's army. Interestingly, resembling the Roman testudo or tortoise formation, these warriors battled in a fish-scale formation, a phrase coined by the Chinese to represent a close-knit, protected configuration that moved as one. Such tactics were unknown to any army in Central Asia. Even in the brief military report, the depiction was striking. Because of this oddity, several academics have questioned if these odd soldiers were surviving members of the Roman legion that was taken at Carrhae. In the event that the convicts were taken east to Margiana and then slowly made their way across Central Asia, either by forced transfer, mercenary service, or migration, to the court of imagination. The scope of Gigi's goals further heightens the intrigue. He gathered an army with sophisticated tactics and outside experts, and he constructed a huge stone fortress, unusual for nomadic leaders. Could warriors with Roman training have helped with his defenses? Chinese texts claim that these foreign troops fought valiantly throughout the final siege, defending the citadel walls with their formation until Han armies overran them. Many of these fighters were reportedly taken by the Han after the loss. Some were transported east into China and may have been sent to the western frontier areas, but the most were put to death. Lixian is one village that sticks out. Lixian, which is in the province of Gansu, has a name that is quite similar to Legion. For many years, suspicion has been fueled by local folklore, peculiar facial traits among locals, and recurring rumors of Roman heritage. Although these finds are still debatable and challenging to confirm, some even assert that Roman coins and artifacts were discovered there. Is this village where Rome's lost boys will finally rest? Or is it just a case of cultural myth-making and historical coincidence? The trail is subtle yet alluring, and it gets stranger the further one dives. Located in the arid regions of Gansu Province, China, Lixian is a small village with a well-known reputation. Due to an enduring tale, this isolated community has drawn the interest of geneticists, historians, and the general public for many years. Lixian may be the last burial place of the lost Roman legionaries who were taken at Carhai and transported eastward across Asia, according to certain theories. The name itself is where the narrative starts. Lixian is thought by some academics to be a transcription of Legion, or Roma, and it first appears in Chinese documents as early as the Han dynasty. Lixian was seen as a border outpost during the Han era, remote from the imperial heartland, and a sensible place to house foreign POWs. Eventually, rumors started to spread that Lixian's population wasn't all Chinese. The aspect of the village was what sustained the legend. Western explorers in the early 20th century reported seeing people with aquiline noses, bright eyes, and extremely fair hair, qualities uncommon in the area. Skulls were measured, photographs were taken, and the idea that the people of Lixian were descended from Romans started to gain traction in the media. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a variety of books and articles stoked the fires by approaching the concept with differing levels of enthusiasm and skepticism. Residents of Lixian have been the subject of DNA testing in recent decades. The findings were not definitive. There were a few genetic markers that were typical of populations in the West, but nothing that was distinctly Roman. Critics contend that these characteristics may result from centuries of intermixing along the Silk Road, as Central Asia has always been a crossroads of many ethnic groupings. Nevertheless, the story's tenacity and the village's acceptance of it continue to garner attention. Lixian has capitalized on its mythological past. At the entrance are statues with Roman themes. Vendors offering Roman goods and imitation centurion performances welcome visitors. Whether based on fact or fiction, the Lost Legion has grown to represent the village's culture and its citizens' pride. However, the question is still open. Was this really where Roman soldiers settled? Or is the tale of Lixian an intriguing combination of chance, folklore, and wishful thinking? The truth is buried deep beneath ages of sand, quiet, and dominion, if it is hidden beneath the fiction. However, one thing is for sure. Lixian might be the final vestige of Rome in the east, but the Lost Legion's voyage did not finish at Carrhae. Science was the logical next step as the Lixian legend received international notice. Could the story of Roman descendants in China be supported or refuted by DNA evidence? In order to analyze their genetic heritage, Chinese geneticists gathered blood samples from a number of Lixian villages in the early 2000s, while collaborating with researchers from other countries. The findings generated debate, headlines, and more questions than they did answers. According to the original findings, genetic markers more frequently found in European populations than in East Asian ones were present in roughly 56% of the studied villages. Some claimed that this supported the Roman theory. The tale was published in newspapers. Television crews flocked to the settlement to document what appeared to be live evidence of ancient Roman wanderers in China, and headlines claimed that the riddle of the lost legion had finally been solved. However, the scientific community quickly warned against making snap judgments. The markers discovered in Lixian villages, according to geneticists, were neither exclusively Roman nor even exclusively European. Long before and long after the Battle of Kari, people were migrating east and west over the Silk Road, making Central Asia a melting pot for millennia. At any time, migrants, traders, mercenaries, and nomads could have introduced genes into the population. Moreover, subsequent peer-reviewed research was unable to confirm the original findings. More thorough DNA analysis revealed that the Lixian villages shared genetic characteristics with Han Chinese communities in the area. Regional variation or centuries of mixing with Central Asian peoples who shared similar appearances might readily account for the so-called European features. Nevertheless, the concept persisted. Some contended that the cultural, linguistic, and historical breadcrumbs could not be disregarded, even if genetic evidence remained difficult. Others maintained that the story's romantic appeal had surpassed the available data. Although the majority of scientists are skeptical, the possibility remains, however dimly, due to the lack of conclusive evidence. In the end, genetics provided no conclusive evidence. The myth of Roman legionaries in China was neither substantiated nor categorically denied, but it did draw attention to something more profound: how legends live on through belief as much as heredity. Furthermore, it appears that belief is more difficult to suppress than science, not only in Lixian, but also in the larger historical and archaeological record. The search for answers is still ongoing. Perhaps ruins, documents, and partially dust-covered roads hold the answer to this puzzle rather than genes. Since the genetic evidence is still uncertain, many archaeologists and historians have resorted to artifacts as an alternative kind of proof. Could the idea of a Roman presence deep in Asia be supported by artifacts like coins, weapons, fortifications, burial sites, or physical remains? Scholars have searched throughout Western China and Central Asia, but the trail is still eerily thin. Coins, pieces of armor, and even tools that resemble Roman construction tools are among the many Roman-style items that have supposedly been discovered in and around the Lixian region over the years. The idea has been fueled by claims made by certain local museums and tourism boards that these artifacts are evidence of Roman ancestry. However, specialists have advised care in nearly all of these cases. Many of these artifacts might have easily arrived through commerce, have no provenance, or don't match known Roman designs. For instance, Roman coins have been discovered all over Central Asia, including in Western China, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. However, their existence does not always indicate habitation. Roman commodities were traded thousands of miles from the boundaries of the empire along the Silk Road, a massive commercial route. A Chinese tea bowl in a Viking cemetery may have no greater significance than a Roman coin in a Chinese grave. Interesting, but not evidence of migration. The potential presence of Roman-style fortifications in the Talas River Valley, where the Han army engaged Zhiji Chanyu in battle in 36 BCE, is one of the most intriguing but unverified theories. Given its unique design for nomadic tribes, several scholars have conjectured that the stone-walled castle recorded in Chinese literature may have been constructed with Roman assistance. However, no excavation has turned up overtly Roman inscriptions or architectural methods. The absence of inscriptions or written records is a significant barrier to archaeological confirmation of the account. Despite the fact that the Romans kept extensive records, no Latin writing has ever been discovered in these purported eastern outposts. it becomes quite challenging to directly link any object or structure to a Roman legion in the absence of inscriptions. The archaeological quiet is ultimately both interesting and frustrating. It provides just enough space for both hope and skepticism, because historically, the lack of evidence does not automatically imply the presence of something, and maybe the tale of Rome in the East is still waiting to be discovered in some deserted valley beneath unspoiled soil. One must first examine the characteristics of the Roman Empire and its relationship with the East in order to determine if a Roman legion could have actually made it to China. Rome was vast, but it could only go so far. Beyond Parthia lay a world that Rome knew only in rumors, the enigmatic land of Serica, China. The empire extended from the foggy coasts of Britain to the arid regions of Syria. Although their knowledge of China was limited, the Romans were aware of it. Silk, spices, jade, and other commodities were transported westward by trade along the Silk Road. Chinese silk was prized by Roman aristocrats who thought it was combed from the leaves of unidentified plants or grew on trees. The Chinese were also aware of a far-off empire known as Daqin, which is today widely accepted by scholars to be Rome. The two civilizations did, however, have intermittent and indirect communication. Although traders, middlemen, and interpreters transported products and rumors across mountains and deserts, no official Roman envoy ever made it to the Chinese imperial court. The closest recorded effort occurred in 166 CE, when a party arrived in China claiming to be from Andon, who was believed to be the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Scholars, however, believe the envoys were traders looking for notoriety. Therefore, how plausible is it that a detachment of Roman soldiers ended up in China, since there was hardly any formal communication between the empires? The notion is not wholly unrealistic. The Silk Road served as a corridor of migration as well as a commercial route, occasionally providing new homes for displaced peoples, mercenaries, and warriors. Local leaders like Zhiji Chanyu frequently enlisted foreign troops to bolster their army, and the Parthians had the incentive and resources to repurpose Roman prisoners to their eastern frontiers. It's also important to remember that Rome occasionally stationed troops for decades in remote and hostile locations. In frontier areas, soldiers were used to local customs, intermarriage, and cultural blending. It is conceivable for a legion to endure, change, and be forgotten after being split apart by conflict, deprived of leadership, and assimilated into a different culture. From probable dispersal in Parthia to military duty in Central Asia to colonization in China, however, there is still a significant leap. Roman historians' silence on such a migration is deafening, but the prospect itself points to Rome's legacy as a human story that extends well beyond its borders, not just as a political force. And if such a story did happen, its last chapter might be about the blending of myth and memory rather than Rome or China, because it fills that enticing gap between what is known and what might be true. The myth of the lost Roman legion in the East persists rather than because of overwhelming proof. For adventurers, romantics, and historians alike, it is a tale of possibilities. It is impossible to resist the notion of Roman soldiers establishing new lives in a distant region beneath unfamiliar sky. The story of the Lost Legion has all the makings of an empire which has been based on conquest for millennia, yet is remembered through tradition. Ancient documents that allude to odd alien forces, a dramatic defeat, a disappearing army, and a far-off settlement whose inhabitants look just different enough to pique curiosity. Its mystique is only increased by the fact that no concrete evidence has ever surfaced. Every hole in the historical record opens the door to conjecture. However, myth is not worthless. Even though there are no Roman soldiers in Lycian, the myth illustrates how civilizations use narrative to create identity. Though theoretical, the Roman connection has become ingrained in the Lycian villagers' culture. It has influenced local tourism, academic pursuits, and even self-esteem. The notion that a Roman military thread may have been woven into the fabric of China also questions our conception of what Rome was for readers in the past and present. The narrative also explores the nature of memory, how conflicts are recalled, how the vanquished are forgotten, and how the human tendency to rationalize the inexplicable transforms quiet into myth. It's difficult to believe that 10,000 skilled Roman troops could completely vanish, so we suppose that they changed rather than disappeared. They marched east toward their destiny rather than westward in retreat. Until modern technology clearly confirms or disproves the mythology, the Lost Legion continues to be a potent emblem of tenacity, cultural spread, and the profound currents of human migration that draw clear limits. The mythology serves as a reminder that history isn't necessarily set in stone, if nothing else. It can occasionally be heard in the echoes of old roads, in languages that have been forgotten, in the bend of a shield or the tilt of an eye, and in the tales we decide to share. And that leads us to the last query. Does the veracity of the legend matter? If so many people already believe it to be true, the tale of the Lost Legion has left a legacy that goes far beyond a minor footnote in military history, regardless of whether Roman soldiers ever make it to China. It has inspired decades of research, reinterpreted the limits of intercultural interaction in antiquity, and demonstrated how one incident, Carhae, can have repercussions that span ages and continents. This mythology is fundamentally about more than just missing warriors. It's about the boundaries of empire, human tenacity, and the peculiar intersections of civilizations. Despite its highways and conquests, Rome was never alone. China wasn't either. Along with commerce, the Silk Road brought together diverse cultures via ideas, languages, beliefs, and yes, even people. Historians are continually discovering the routes in which soldiers, traders, diplomats, and prisoners traveled around Eurasia. The narrative also compels us to reevaluate how historical memory is structured. Common soldiers' fates are rarely followed up on in ancient sources, particularly after a defeat, although this does not imply that their tales stopped with the final combat that was documented. No record was left behind as many were absorbed into new planets. However, some of them might have contributed to the development of the cultures they were assimilated into through tradition, custom, or genetic imprint. The Lost Legion mythology is more than just a historical conundrum. It's a metaphor. It illustrates how people adjust even as empires come and go, how skilled combatants can become foreigners, farmers, or fathers, how the Roman eagle might have set roots somewhere else instead of returning to Rome after being transported to the ends of the world. Myth and fact have merged in Lycian. The people of the village have chosen to include the myth into their identity, regardless of whether they are sprung from Roman legionaries. As a result, they have become a live illustration of history's most enduring lesson. The past is dynamic. Every generation that recounts its history changes it. Thus it's possible that the Lost Legion never constructed a citadel in China. Perhaps the testudo under Han flags was never adopted. Perhaps it just disappeared. However, the mystery endures not in DNA or ruins, but rather in the silent conviction that history is replete with unexplored or undiscovered paths. And maybe the remains of Rome are still waiting beneath the dirt of antiquity. In ancient Mesopotamia, a woman made her mark on the foundation of our intellectual inheritance long before the names of Socrates or Confucius reverberated across history. She went by Enhedu Anna, and many people believe that she was the first novelist in history, male or female. She lived in what is now southern Iraq in the city of circa 2300 BCE. She was a priestess, poet, political theorist, and philosopher who influenced her civilization's intellectual and spiritual life, in addition to being a religious figure. The emperor, who brought the Sumerian and Akkadian city-states together to form one of the earliest empires in history, Sargon of Akkad, was the father of Enhedu Anna. Enhedu Anna who was appointed High Priestess of the Moon, god Nana in had tremendous power in the political and ecclesiastical arenas. Her place in intellectual history, however, was secured by her voice, which was preserved in clay tablets. She composed a number of theological poetry and temple hymns, such as the well-known Exaltation of Inanna, which addressed Enheduanna's own devotion, hardships and revelations, in addition to praising the goddess of love and battle. Metaphor, structure and passion abound in her writing. They reveal a mind that can combine poetry and power, theology and statecraft. Enheduanna was not writing under false pretenses. I, Enheduanna, wrote this, she wrote as her signature. It was revolutionary to assert authorship. It made a woman's voice heard in a field dominated by priests, scribes and rulers. Her songs weren't ceremonial rites, they were ideological frameworks. They gently backed her father's political merger of various peoples under a single empire by helping to standardize worship throughout Sumer and Akkad. Her work was copied and studied for centuries after her death, which is even more amazing. Some of her poems were considered as examples of literary quality in scribal schools and persisted well into the Babylonian era. Her language, which combined Akkadian and Sumerian traditions, served as an intellectual bridge in and of itself. This also applied to Enheduanna. She was the first in a long and frequently unnoticed line of women who influenced art, medicine, and philosophy long before their names were well known. And even if clay tablets deteriorate with time, her cuneiform-etched voice endures as a proclamation. Thought architects, builders, and philosophers have always been women. In addition to being revered as mothers, wives, and priestesses, women in ancient Egypt were also scientists, particularly in the field of medicine. Pacitia, who is frequently referred to as the first female doctor in history, was one of the most prominent. According to her grave inscriptions, she was the superintendent of female physicians during the 5th dynasty, which began approximately 2400 BCE. Just that title is impressive. It implies that she oversaw a whole group of female healers in addition to practicing medicine herself. For its time, Egyptian medicine was extremely sophisticated. Thanks in part to the embalming procedure, doctors acquired access to comprehensive anatomical knowledge. They researched illness, trauma, pregnancy, and labor. Female health was regarded as a serious and specialized profession, as evidenced by numerous medical papyri, such as the Kahun gynecological papyrus. Women looked out for one another, especially when it came to pregnancy, childbirth, and contraception. They employed herbal remedies, surgical instruments, poultices, and even sophisticated diagnosis based on observation and symptoms. Despite being the most well-documented, Pacitia probably was one of many educated women. Temples served as therapeutic facilities, particularly those dedicated to goddesses like Hathor or Sekhmet. Priestesses with training in herbal medicine and ceremonial medicine frequently served as healers and midwives. These women weren't just helpers, they were independent scholars who committed lengthy, intricate medical texts, often transmitted orally or written on scrolls, to memory. In ancient Egypt, women were frequently educated, particularly those from aristocratic or pious families. If their position permitted it, girls learnt to read and write hieroglyphics. Additionally, individuals may advance through the ranks of temple schools and acquire both scientific and spiritual knowledge. In Egyptian philosophy, the line between religion and science was blurred, and women moved with unexpected authority inside that realm. The majority of these early scholars' names have been forgotten despite the passing of millennia. Only pieces of their contributions, recipes, diagnoses, grave rolls, and the tools they buried with remain. But there is no denying their legacy. Ancient Egypt is a reminder of a time when women were trusted with knowledge as well as life, in a world where restrictions on female education would eventually last for generations. Similar trends were also beginning to appear in other parts of the ancient world, especially in Greece, where a woman in the city of Cyrene dared to question the male monopoly on philosophy. The study of philosophy was not limited to men in the Greek city of Cyrene, which is situated in present-day Libya. One of the few female classical philosophers with a given name resided there in the 4th century BCE. Her name was Arete of Cyrene. She wasn't only a passive participant in a field dominated by men. Arete was a philosopher, educator, and disseminator of ideas that would influence future generations. Aristippus, the founder of the Cyrenaic school of philosophy and a pupil of Socrates, was the father of Arete. This school placed a strong emphasis on inner freedom, happiness, and pleasure, not that these things were more important than material ones, and that self-control and moderation were the keys to true joy. Growing up in this scholarly setting, Arete learned from her father and ultimately took on his responsibilities. According to sources, she spent more than 35 years teaching philosophy, instructing hundreds of students, including Mother taught, her own son, Aristippus the Younger. This wasn't a poetic title. He deserved it since she was the one who taught him philosophy, not male teachers or institutions. The majority of her contributions have survived because of references made by succeeding authors who recognized her leadership in the Cyrenaic tradition, such Diogenes Laertius. Though no surviving manuscripts are directly credited to Arete, her influence is clear in the continuous development of her father's views, concepts that emphasized logical ethics, intellectual autonomy, and the quest of inner peace. In a society where strict hierarchy and public spectacle predominate, these lessons were not insignificant. They served as instruments for fortitude and individual autonomy. Arete led a philosophical school influencing both male and female brains in a society when most women were supposed to keep quiet and be invisible. She questioned the widely held belief that intelligence and reason belonged to men. Through her lectures, she established that women could shape philosophical systems, not only follow them. Like many ancient female scholars, Arete's story is only partially preserved. However, those pieces are potent. They serve as a reminder that philosophy has never been exclusively associated with one gender. And her voice continues to reverberate through the history of thought, soft but unbroken, from Cyrene's sunny courtyards. One woman dared to take the podium and give one of the most famous speeches in Roman history in an era when males dominated public life and political speaking was seen as a masculine privilege. She became an independent rhetoric scholar and was named Hortensia, daughter of the renowned orator Quintus Hortensius Hortalis. She was more than just a speech student, though. She was a lady who used her voice to confront the Roman state itself. 42 BCE was the year. The political situation in Rome was chaotic. After Julius Caesar's death, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, his successors, required money to fight his killers. They suggested taxing the wealthiest Roman citizens in order to raise funds. Unusually, this included taxing affluent women, even though Roman women had no political representation or voting rights. Rome's elite women were indignant over the proposition, but only one of them dared to address the triumvirs: Hortensia. Hortensia stood up and gave a harsh and reasoned criticism in the Roman Forum, where few women had ever spoken in front of the people. She maintained that women shouldn't be compelled to pay for a war in which they had no say if they were not permitted to serve in the military, hold public office, or engage in political activities. The triumvirs decided to tax 400 women instead of 400 because of how persuasive and well-argued her speech was. Hortensia's mastery of eloquence was not an inherited talent. It was the outcome of intense mental preparation. She learned the intricacies of Roman law and the persuasive power of speech from her upbringing in a home that was rife with oratory and legal dispute. Reason, precedent, and moral appeal, all characteristics of the finest Roman rhetoric, were all united in her argument. Her voice is preserved in Appian's writings, providing a unique window into how women may exercise power and intelligence in a strict patriarchal culture. Her words influenced policy even though she was not a public official. And more than that, they attacked Rome's beliefs about who had the right to speak. Scholarly women did not always hide behind temples or manuscripts, as Hortensia reminds us. At times, they bravely stood in the public square, equipped with reason rather than weapons. During a period when Confucian principles emphasized male dominance and female silence in the courtly halls of Han Dynasty China, one woman defied convention, not via rebellion, but through research. She was a Confucian scholar, a teacher of royal princesses, and the first female historian in China. Her name was Ban Jiao. She gained a unique position of influence in a culture that is overwhelmingly patriarchal, thanks to her intelligence, tact, and literary knowledge. Ban Jiao was the sister of Ban Gu, the Han court's official historian, and the daughter of renowned historian Ban Biao. She was born in 35 CE. Ban Jiao was asked to finish the epic book of Hanshu, because her brother passed away before it was finished. Without hesitation, she took up the duty. She did not publish flimsy editions. She wrote important passages, especially about astronomy, rituals, and the lives of famous ladies. One of the most important historical documents of Chinese civilization was completed with her assistance. However, Ban Jiao's impact went beyond the past. Lessons for Women, Nujie, her best-known independent work, became one of the most read books for teaching girls about traditional Chinese culture. It supported female education even as it upheld Confucian principles of reverence, submission, and humility. According to Ban Jiao, women ought to be morally pure, literate, and intellectually ready for the responsibilities of marriage and parenthood. According to her, how could a woman effectively run a home or raise children if she was ignorant? Contemporary readers would perceive inconsistencies in her writing as a lady advocating for conventional gender norms while leading a life that challenged them. However, Ban Jiao's subtlety was her talent. She worked within the system, arguing for greater access to education by citing established ideals. She trained royal daughters and empresses at the imperial palace, demonstrating her power there. Her voice helped define the moral framework of Dynasty China. With scrolls in hand, Ban Jiao passed through the gates of authority rather than storming them. She also made it possible for generations of Chinese women to further their education. During the 4th and early 5th centuries CE, a woman who became the epitome of classical learning stood amid the busy, multicultural city of Alexandria. A mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, Hypatia attracted students from all across the Mediterranean with her brilliance. Hypatia continued to be a representation of reason, knowledge, and the enduring force of inquiry during a period when the Roman Empire was disintegrating and religious tensions were increasing. Theon, a prominent mathematician and philosopher at the renowned Library of Alexandria, was the father of Hypatia. She was trained from an early age, surpassing her father's instruction and giving public lectures in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. She was a teacher of Neoplatonism, a school of thought that carried on Plato's intellectual legacy and placed an emphasis on ethics, logic, and the search for truth via reason. She did not confine her classroom to libraries or temples. Hypatia lectured publicly in the streets and forums of Alexandria, drawing vast numbers of students, including both pagans and Christians. She created better astrolabe designs, produced treatises on conic sections, and might have helped preserve Ptolemy's Almagest and Euclid's Elements. Her influence can be heard in the writings of her pupils and colleagues, even though none of her original works have survived. However, Hypatia lived in a period of upheaval and change. In the Roman realm, Christianity was gaining ground, and religious factionalism was rampant in Alexandria. A well-known pagan scholar and public thinker, Hypatia became a source of both awe and animosity. She was at conflict with Bishop Cyril, the influential leader of Alexandria's Christian community, because of her close relationship to the Roman governor Orestes. A group of Christian fanatics savagely killed her in 415 CE, stripped her, carried her through the streets, and dismembered her in a church. Her death marked more than the end of her existence. It signaled the start of a more sinister intellectual era and the symbolic demise of classical education in the West. Hypatia's recollection, however, persisted. Her contributions were cited by Arab scholars of the Middle Ages. She is a lasting symbol of female knowledge and scientific bravery, and enlightened thinkers hailed her as a martyr for reason. Women were frequently denied access to formal education and legal authority in the scholarly realm of ancient Judaism, where male rabbis controlled public discourse and the interpretation of sacred texts. Nevertheless, despite these stringent restrictions, Jewish women managed to contribute to and influence the intellectual life of their societies in subtle yet long-lasting ways. Their voices can be heard in rabbinic texts, midrashic commentary, and oral traditions, providing insights into a hidden realm of female study, even though they are rarely documented as rabbis or sages. One such person was the mythical Talmudic woman Bruria, who is thought to have lived in the 2nd century CE. She was the daughter of Rabbi Hananiah ben Tiradion, a martyr who was persecuted by the Romans, and the wife of Rabbi Meir, one of the most revered sages of his era. Bruria was renowned for her profound understanding of Jewish law, in addition to her piety and moral fortitude. In a rare acknowledgement for a woman in that era, the Talmud attributes her to having debated halachic topics with male experts and out-argued them. In one section, she offers a more sympathetic reading of a psalm and corrects her husband's interpretation. In another, she challenges a fellow rabbi's presumptions and undermines his argument using textual logic. None of these tales were allegories. Despite their uniqueness, they were recognitions of women's ability to think critically about sacred law. Women were frequently educated at home, particularly in wealthy households, even though they were typically prohibited from attending yeshivot, or formal Jewish academies. Daughters of scholars were trained to read Hebrew and Aramaic and to study Torah and ethics. Through questioning, storytelling, and commentary, these women passed down and preserved traditions, influencing the spiritual foundation of their communities and offspring. Unnamed women who provided insights into legal disputes, medical expertise, and ritual practice are mentioned in later rabbinic comments. There is no denying the existence of some of these contributions, even if they only remain as footnotes or annotations in bigger works written by men. They create a fragmented, unfinished, yet profoundly meaningful mosaic of memory. Jewish women managed to break past the barriers and communicate through them in order to participate in a study-focused culture. Philosophy, poetry, and spirituality were transmitted orally in ancient India long before printed books or official universities, and women were not quiet participants in this river of knowledge. They were questioners, composers, and voices. The female sages of the Vedic and early post-Vedic eras were among the first and most influential. Their teachings are still recited in Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu traditions. The Rig Veda, one of the world's oldest sacred scriptures, provides one of the most striking examples. Its thousands of hymns include some credited to female seers or rishikas. Hymns that examined metaphysics, ritual, and interior experience were written by Lopamudra, Ghosha, Apala, and others. For example, Lopamudra challenged her husband, the sage Agastya, to reconcile asceticism with the life of the senses through spiritual discourse. Her poetry exhibits both philosophical audacity and poetic elegance. Centuries later, as devotional bhakti groups spread throughout South Asia, female poet saints resurfaced with mysterious and very intimate works. Andal, a little girl who was adopted by a priest in Tamil Nadu, composed fervent songs to Lord Vishnu that combined emotional fervor with doctrinal understanding. Her compositions are still performed in Indian temples today. Despite living in the medieval era, northern ladies like Mirabai drew inspiration from antiquated customs. Mirabai, who was born into a royal family, lived as a wandering devotee, sung of her spiritual marriage to Krishna, and disregarded social norms. Her writings expressed passionate love for the holy while criticizing gender roles, caste, and religious hierarchy. The voices of early Buddhist women are captured in the Therigatha, which are the senior nuns' poetry written in Pali about the 6th century BCE. These poems discuss enlightenment, renunciation, and the fight for freedom, and are recited by former queens, courtesans, and laywomen who became nuns. "I have given up my son, my wealth, and my craving," says Sumangala's mother, a nun, in severe terms. "Today I follow the path of peace." These women were not marginal, they were foundational. Their poetry is not merely religious, it is philosophical investigation, social commentary, and psychological understanding. Their words live on even though their biographies are frequently forgotten or oversimplified. The contributions made by female ancient intellectuals were marginalized for centuries. Their accomplishments were hidden beneath layers of institutional erasure and cultural bias. Their names were deleted from documents, and their works were excluded from canons. Nevertheless, their sounds persisted, occasionally in fragments and occasionally in whispers, always defying quiet. From Hortensia in Rome to the Rishikas of India, from Enheduanna in Sumer to Banjiao in China, what all the women we have studied have in common is not only that they were uncommon, but also that they persisted. Women's access to formal education, public office, and authorship was restricted in their society. However, they managed to get in through political crises, artistic traditions, religious organizations, or family lines. They took advantage of opportunities and used the resources at their disposal to leave intellectual legacies. Many of these women used traditionally recognized roles, priestess, healer, mother, nun, not as restrictions, but as platforms. Enheduanna wrote hymns that influenced civilizations using her religious stance. Bruraya and Banjiao participated in male-dominated scholarship while advocating for women's education. In public spaces, Hypatia gave lectures. Hortensia directly confronted political authorities. They all thought without waiting for permission. However, why were they overlooked? Because scribes, monks, librarians, and academies, the systems that kept history, were predominantly male and frequently disinterested in conserving the stories of women. The idea that brilliant thought was a male domain led to the gradual rewriting of entire chapters of intellectual history. This was erasure, not merely loss. It is not about projecting contemporary identity politics onto the past in order to recover the lives and contributions of ancient female intellectuals. It's about getting everything back in balance. It's about realizing that the roots of science, philosophy, literature, and spirituality were not constructed by males alone. Women were constantly present, writing poetry, discussing the law, tending to the ill, watching the stars, and posing challenging queries about reality and life. Their tales alter our perception of the past. More crucially, they challenge who gets to shape the future. Because every time we find a forgotten academic, we redefine what knowledge means and who it belongs to. And by doing this, we not only respect but also carry on their heritage. The discovery made by Soviet archaeologists in 1948, deep under the Altai Mountains' permafrost, would fundamentally alter our understanding of prehistoric tattooing. It was more than a few trinkets and a skeleton. They discovered a mummified body that had been kept in ice for more than 2,400 years. It belonged to a Scythian aristocrat and was the well-known Pasirich burial. And on his skin, a vast canvas of animal tattoos. Mythological creatures gracefully spiraled and curled around his limbs. Fanciful cats mid-pounce, griffins with ferocious claws, and deer with long antlers. These weren't ornamental body art or doodling. These were revered representations of status, identity, and power. Stories were conveyed through tattoos in Scythian culture. What you had done, who you were, and your ranking. This man in particular had been buried with a team of sacrificed horses, ornate attire, and priceless gold jewelry. But even without all of that, his privileged status would have been obvious from his tattoos alone. The ink's distribution over his arms, shoulders, and legs all allude to a custom that is exclusive to the military and noble classes. You didn't simply ask for a tiger on your back when you entered a Scythian camp. These designs were earned. And the technique? Yes, primitive, but incredibly accurate. They used bone or brass needles to penetrate the skin, rubbing in soot or pulverized charcoal. It hurt a lot, but that was part of the purpose. It was a sign of toughness and a rite of passage to endure the needle. And those tattoos would accompany you into the afterlife, encasing your spirit in emblems of courage and honor until you passed away. Even though the Pazyryk mummies are now kept in Russian museums, anthropologists and tattoo artists alike continue to be influenced by their legacy. These inked warriors serve as a reminder that tattooing originated on the skin of ancient rulers, on windy steppes and in frigid tombs rather than in a contemporary studio. And if this is what the Scythians left behind, just wait until you see what the Egyptians accomplished. In the heart of ancient Egypt, long before ink met needle in modern studios, tattoos performed a different purpose, one rooted in magic, healing, and ritual. Most stories focus on the tombs and temples of the pharaohs, but the silent traces on women's bodies tell a different, much more personal tale. The mummy of Amunè, a priestess of the goddess Hathor, who was buried in 2000 BCE, was found by archaeologists in 1891. Across her arms, torso, and thighs, there was a web of dark spots and lines. They weren't ornaments, they were symbols of divine protection, fertility, and ritual prestige engraved forever into her skin. During the Middle Kingdom, tattooing seems to have been a female-only practice in ancient Egypt. Sacred dancers, priestesses, and midwives all had geometric tattoos in symmetrical designs and bands. These intentional markings were frequently made across the pelvis, breasts, and abdomen. In temples devoted to female deities such as Hathor or Isis, they probably functioned to protect childbirth, channel healing abilities, or improve ceremonial performances. Egyptian tattoos were straightforward but effective, in contrast to the Scythians' elaborate animal tattoos. Their symmetry and repetition point to ceremonial importance rather than haphazard, artistic expression. With their own spiritual power, every line and dot functioned as a permanent amulet. By today's standards, the implements were primitive, bronze or copper needles, occasionally sharpened bone, and pigments soaked in indigo or soot. Although it hurt a lot, it was a necessary part of the ritual. In certain instances, tattooing may have been performed while accompanied by incantations or songs, making the practice a religious rite. Thebes murals show female singers and dancers with matching tattoos, indicating that women with tattoos were prominent figures in religious life. During rituals, their rhythmic and planned movements would make the tattoos come to life. Egyptian ladies wore their prayers stitched into their body to honor, protect, and heal the divine, while the Scythians donned their myth-like armor. Tattooing then developed into a whole language, a biography inked on the body, in the remote Pacific Islands. In large parts of the Pacific Ocean, tattooing evolved from tradition to identity. Tatau, or tattoos, were considered living scriptures in Polynesian civilizations, especially in Samoa, Tonga, and the Marquesas Islands. They bore the burden of spiritual ties, courage, rank, and ancestry. In many communities, to be untattooed was to be incomplete, and every curve and line had significance. Polynesian tattoos were widespread and very noticeable, in contrast to those in Egypt or Scythia. They frequently wrapped around the thighs, buttocks, and lower back of men, extending from the waist to the knees. Months or even years may pass before this intricate design, known as the P in Samoa, is finished. Although the procedure was harsh and the anguish was immense, the end product was a masterpiece of personal history. Wearing the P was a way to show the world one's fortitude, dignity, and ancestry. Like the artwork themselves, the instruments were symbolic. Tufuga, or tattoo artists, used handcrafted combs made from turtle shell or boar tusk. To get the ink into the skin, these were dipped in a pigment made of soot and pounded with a mallet. Just as much a part of the ceremony as the ink was the sound of tattooing, the steady pounding of bone against bone. Although their designs were usually smaller and found on the hands, thighs, and mouth area, women also had tattoos. In some areas, a woman's grace, maturity, and readiness to serve her society were symbolized by the malu, a beautiful design carved over the inner thighs. Though smaller than the men's, these tattoos were just as revered. Ceremonies for tattoos were both social and religious. Prayers were said, music was sung, and families gathered. A rite of passage that united the living and the dead was a mixture of blood, sweat, and ash. Ancestors were thought to oversee the ceremony, blessing the recipient and directing the tufuga's hand. In Polynesia, getting a tattoo wasn't a fashion statement. It was an agreement between the gods, the tribe, and the individual. Accepting the tattoo meant carrying a full lineage on one's flesh, while refusing it may lead to disgrace. The custom would eventually clash with missionaries, colonists, and even prisons as it spread from the Pacific Islands. However, another change was taking place in Japan long before that. Tattoos were on the verge of becoming a symbol of both loyalty and disobedience. Tattooing in Japan developed along two seemingly opposing trajectories, banned and sacred. Originally utilized for spiritual and decorative purposes, these inked designs, known as irizumi, have come to symbolize lawlessness, disobedience, and unadulterated perseverance. The artistry never diminished, even though what started out as dedication ended up as stigma. More than 10,000 years ago, during the Jomon period, tattooing was first documented in Japan. This period's clay figures have marks that are thought to be body tattoos. These might have been associated with shamanic status, religious rites, or protective symbols. It wasn't until the Edo era, 1603–1868, that irizumi blossomed into a sophisticated visual language. Originally, tattoos were used for spiritual reasons. As a tangible representation of their commitments and meditation focus, some Buddhist monks had holy Sanskrit characters permanently inked on their arms. Some patterns were intended to serve as enduring prayers or to ward off evil spirits. Others mirrored the compassion bodhisattva, a monk's own commitment to canon. However, as time went on, irizumi began to associate with darker things. The government punished those with tattoos during the Edo period. Criminals were permanently branded by having symbols placed on their arms or foreheads. These coerced tattoos were degrading and intended to permanently separate offenders from society. They were not ornamental. Ironically, though, these marks ended up serving as the foundation for resistance. Tattoos were a mark of honor for gamblers, outlaws, and later, Yakuza criminal members. By adorning their bodies with extensive hand-poke tattoos of dragons, koi fish, tigers, geishas, and other mythological images, they turned the stigma into a spectacle. The procedure was painful and frequently involved applying ink gradually over weeks or even years using a steady hand and a long metal needle known as a nomi. These full-body tattoos, which were concealed behind clothes, came to represent devotion, stoicism, and strength. One's inked legacy, bold, detailed, and intensely personal, was exposed in bathhouses where garments were removed. Irizumi persisted as an underground art form in spite of being prohibited or disapproved of. The contrasts of Japanese society, spiritual but rebellious, holy yet illegal, were reflected in tattooing. A thug might wear ink to honor his code, and a monk to honor enlightenment. Additionally, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were carving ink into bone to honor family, territory, and the spirit world, while Japan's ink danced between light and shadow across the ocean. Rich and varied tattooing traditions, each closely linked to land, ancestry, and the holy, were already established by the indigenous peoples of the Americas even before Columbus stepped foot in the New World. Body ink was used as a live document of one's ancestry, accomplishments, and spiritual status anywhere from the Central American rainforests to the Arctic tundra. In the Arctic, tattooing was frequently a female privilege among the Inuit. Women wore delicate, dark lines on their foreheads, cheekbones, and chins that were engraved employing a technique that was both exact and archaic. Bone needles were used to extract soot-dipped threads beneath the skin. These tattoos on the face were more than just decorations. They indicated a woman's ability to withstand hardship, her connection to the spirit world, and her preparedness for marriage. There were even those who thought the tattoos led spirits to the afterlife. Numerous tribes, like the Sioux, Osage, and Haudenosaunee, utilized tattoos to denote status, courage, and tribal allegiance in the forests and plains of North America, further south. For bravery in combat, a warrior may be awarded a tattoo, with each design signifying a particular kill or feat. The stories these tattoos told were well known in the community, and they were earned rather than given carelessly. Sharp instruments made of fishbone or obsidian were frequently used in the procedure, and the color was created from powdered minerals or charcoal. Ceremonies for tattooing were sacred and communal. The ceremonies would be conducted by elders, shamans, or authorized tattoo artists, frequently with prayers and chanting. Although the pain was severe, it strengthened pride and fortitude. The Aztecs and Maya raised tattooing to the level of ritual theater in Mesoamerica. During religious festivals, tattoos were applied in remembrance of deities such as Itzamna or Quetzalcoatl. Complex designs with glyphs, heavenly bodies, or serpents were positioned on the body in key locations for magical effect. Priests utilized tattoos to channel heavenly energy, and warriors wore them as symbols of status and sacrifice. Skin-deep tattooing was never the norm throughout the Americas. It helped people feel more connected to their communities, cosmology, and ancestors. Every mark served as a lasting thread in the identity tapestry. Many of these practices were brutally suppressed as colonization spread throughout the continents, but the ink never completely disappeared. It endured in memory, wounds, and secrecy. The world's oldest tattoos and an unsolved mystery would be left behind by a mummy buried in volcanic ash thousands of years ago on the other side of the globe. In the Ötztal Alps, close to the border between Austria and Italy, two hikers in 1991 happened upon what they believed to be a frozen mountaineer. In reality, they had discovered a man who was more than 5,000 years old and trapped in time. His body would go on to become one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century, and he would be dubbed Ötzi. But Ötzi had something even more fascinating than his clothes, tools, and unexplained cause of death. Ink. There were 61 of them. Ötzi's marks were straightforward, in contrast to the ornamental or symbolic tattoos prevalent in other ancient societies. Groups of crosses and parallel lines on his wrists, lower back, knees, and ankles weren't put there for show. Their positions nearly coincided with joint stress or injury sites found by X-rays and CT scans. This made experts think that, like acupuncture, the tattoos might have had a therapeutic function. As with other early tattooing techniques, the ink itself was created from soot or ash and applied by making tiny skin incisions and rubbing in the pigment. The idea that individuals in prehistoric Europe were utilizing ink and blades for purposes other than identity or ritual, and possibly as medicine, 3,300 years before Christ was born, is astounding. The earliest tattoos ever survived in human history are those of Ötzi. They provide a unique, up-close look at prehistoric life, a world in which the body could still communicate even in the absence of written language. Every line carved into his skin may have been a sign of survival, a scream for pain relief, or a combination of the two. And it is very remarkable that these patterns have persisted for thousands of years under glacial ice. In contrast to the warrior ink of Polynesians or the ceremonial tattoos of Egyptian priestesses, Ötzi's body art was not about prestige or honor. It has to do with function, maybe even healing. However, something incredibly human, the urge to make a mark and use the body as a record and a cure, lies in that unadulterated practicality. We are reminded by Ötzi's ink that tattooing did not originate in tribes or temples. Every scar on the old mountains told a tale, and it all started with suffering and survival. His were the first, but they were by no means the last. Tribal tattooing evolved into a whole rite of passage, a symphony of bravery, blood, and generational memory in Southeast Asia's highlands. In Southeast Asia's mountainous highlands, tattooing evolved into a living history marked by suffering and pride. Ink was integral to identity for the peoples of northern Thailand, the Philippines, and Borneo. It symbolized maturity, warrior status, spiritual favor, and a strong bond with one's ancestors. Tattoos were seen as holy inheritances rather than ornaments, with each line serving as a symbol of valor, belonging, or harmony with the spirit world. For generations, the Batok tradition flourished in the Philippines' Kalinga region. In the past, ladies known as Mamba Batok were nearly the only ones who did this type of tattooing. The tattoo artist would use a wooden stick to rhythmically tap designs into the skin using a thorn from a calamansi tree or a sharpened citrus spine as the needle and soot or charcoal as the color. The slow and painful process was a necessary element of the ritual. Each tattoo signified a successful headhunting trip for Kalinga warriors. A man commanded more respect the more ink he possessed. These tattoos were earned rather than merely worn. Ancestral themes, stylized animals, and complex geometric designs might be applied to the face, arms, and chest. These declarations, which were weighed down by tradition and duty, were societal proof rather than individualistic assertions. In addition, women got tattoos as a sign of their beauty, fertility, and marital preparedness rather than for military purposes. Their ink stood for family heritage, grace, and spiritual purity. In order to create live lines of lineage engraved into skin across generations, mothers frequently passed on designs and locations to their daughters. Similar principles were portrayed by Dayak tattoo culture in Borneo. In addition to being exquisite, spirals, rosettes, and animal designs served as guiding symbols in the afterlife. It was thought that tattoos illuminated the soul's journey after death by glowing in the spirit world. In the afterlife, a person without tattoos can get lost and be unable to locate their ancestors. These customs were all but destroyed by colonization and missionary influence, as is the case with many tribes. They considered tattoos to be shameful, heathen, or archaic. In isolated settlements, however, elders kept on their skill covertly, conserving what they could. There is a revival today. Batok is being reclaimed by descendants of tattooed priestesses and warriors, not as a trend, but as a tradition. While ink can fade from skin, it seldom fades from memory, as evidenced by the resurgence of the ancient patterns. The Amazigh, also called the Berbers, created a tattoo culture that is unmatched in North Africa's steep hills and vast deserts. Tattoos were not tucked away on thighs or shoulders in this fiercely autonomous matrilineal society. They were emblazoned under the chin, across the cheeks or between the eyes, and clearly shown on the face. Each symbol represented a story that was passed down from mother to daughter, generation after generation, in a language that predated writing. Tishbut, or Berber tattoos, had a variety of uses. Fundamentally, they were aesthetic, seen as a way to display a woman's maturity or to improve her beauty. On a deeper level, however, they were protective and spiritual. For example, it was believed that a little cross tattooed between the brows would protect against the evil eye. A woman's marital status, tribe background, or level of spiritual commitment could be indicated by lines that extend from her chin. Additionally, getting a tattoo was a sign of persistence and self-determination among Berber women. Simple tools like a pointed thorn or a needle coated in a mixture of indigo, soot, or even powdered herbs were used. Songs, laughter, or prayers were frequently heard, while the skin was repeatedly massaged and punctured until the pigment set. This was a religious and communal experience rather than merely a cosmetic one. Certain motifs had very intimate connotations. A triangle could stand for fertility or a relationship to the pre-Islamic goddess Tanit, who was connected to protection and life. Celestial beliefs or ancestral spirits were represented by dots, stars, and crescents. A tattooed face was regarded as a woman's soul map in several villages. However, these customs were threatened. As Islam expanded throughout North Africa, tattooing started to conflict with religious beliefs. Permanent body modification was regarded by many Muslim scholars as prohibited or haram. Consequently, the practice gradually decreased. What used to be a mark of honor for women is now seen by some as a sign of backwardness. Elderly ladies in isolated mountain areas, however, continue to proudly display these tattoos as living reminders of a time when tales were etched into skin rather than recorded on paper. Today, both descendants and anthropologists are working feverishly to record this vanishing legacy before it completely vanishes. And lastly, there is still a question as the needle travels over continents and ages. In what ways did tattooing evolve from a religious practice into a contemporary subculture? The global collision of criminalization, colonization, and cultural revival holds the answer. The ancient tattooing art form was enmeshed in a tornado of colonization, shame, and reinvention as the 20th century progressed. In many regions of the world, what was previously sacred, communal, and symbolic was misinterpreted or demonized. Indigenous tattoo customs were seen through a prism of superiority and religious judgment by colonizing powers, especially those from Europe. From the Americas to Southeast Asia, from Africa to Polynesia, traditional tattooing was prohibited, banned, or called barbarous on every continent. It was denounced as pagan by missionaries. As a sign of criminality or social deviance, governments outlawed it. In the late 1800s, Japan's Meiji government outlawed tattooing out of concern that it would bring shame to the nation on the international scene. Warriors with tattoos in the Philippines were compelled to conceal their ancestry under Western clothing. In North America, boarding schools and assimilation efforts forced indigenous tattooing underground. Additionally, tattoos were subtly removed due to religious taboos in certain areas with a predominance of Muslims. However, the ink never really went away, it just fell silent. Tattooing developed in the shadows of prisons, ports, and subcultures. From far-off places, sailors returned with ink to mark their travels on their bodies. In the West, tattoos were associated with rebellion and were popular with bikers, circus performers, and people who were on the fringes of society. The art became provocative instead of sacred. Then something changed. By the late 20th century, tattooing was making a comeback as a means of self-expression rather than as a taboo. In order to reconnect with the stories etched into their DNA, indigenous artists all around the world began to revive their ancestral styles. Ancient tools and rites were brought back by revivalists in Borneo, Samoa, and the Arctic. Native tattoo artists in North America started teaching and relearning almost extinct customs. Tattooing is seeing a comeback these days. Global, mixed, and digital, it has never been more respectful of its origins. Tribal rites coexist with contemporary tattoo parlors. Hand-tapped ink and bone tools are next to Instagram flash sheets. Now what was almost lost is being proudly recovered. Originally a ritual, tattooing underwent repression before resurfacing as a means of bridging the gap between the personal and the ancestral, the past and the present. The echo of those who came before, the Scythian lords, the Egyptian priestesses, the Polynesian warriors, and innumerable others who made the decision to wear their narrative in skin, lives in every dot, line, and symbol.